It's Air Talk. I'm Larry Mantle. Great to have you with us. California's high-speed rail project continues under construction through the Central Valley. The $100 billion price tag, the LA to San Francisco bullet train, has seen 21 construction sites in 5 Central California counties. But the question is, as the price tag continues to increase, does the project still make sense? Are there going to be enough passengers paying a high enough fare to make the project truly worthwhile? With us, the chair of the board of directors of the California High-Speed Rail Authority, Dan Richard. Mr. Richard, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So share with us, what are the biggest reasons that the cost has escalated so dramatically?
Well, first of all, we're not projecting $100 billion at this point. I know the New York Times said that the other day. I think they were kind of rounding up. It's still going to be a huge amount. It's about $78 billion. And one of the reasons that the costs have gone up is just as people go from planning these things to building them and find out that you have to underground certain places or avoid wetlands or things like that, those drive the costs up. But the main thing that's driving the cost up, and it's really a lesson for how we build infrastructure in this country, is that without really sustained funding sources, we've been forced to build this in segments. And when you stretch things out, that's what really adds to the cost. So it's the time that is probably the biggest driver for the cost right now. If we could get a stable commitment from, say, the federal government, we could accelerate things and really bring the cost down.
Isn't the flip side of that, though, if you did it all at once, you wouldn't necessarily be learning from one leg of the project things you could apply to another leg, which would save you time and money?
Well, that's absolutely true. And I didn't mean to suggest we could build it all at once, but we've had to stretch it out over a number of years, and I think there's a happy medium in there.
And at this point, to recoup the cost that we're talking about, what's the anticipation of the fare that would need to be charged and the ridership that it would take?
So one of the things that's important to understand about high-speed rail is that it's very different from your local rail transportation systems, Metro in LA or BART in San Francisco. All those local systems across the country and across the world require subsidies. High-speed rail systems worldwide, once they're built, once the capital cost is put in, usually by a government, they are self-sustaining. And all our estimates show that, in fact, our Bond Act, the state law requires that we show that this would not need an ongoing public subsidy. It would not be like roads, would not be like bus systems or rail systems, local rail systems. So our estimates, we think, are actually pretty conservative. They've been peer-reviewed. And it looks like, in fact, over the first 30 years of its life, the system could generate an excess of $20 billion, and that money will help us really fund the construction of the system. So this is something that the pain of it is in building it, but in operating it, it's going to be self-sustaining. And frankly, if we didn't do this, we'd have to add thousands of miles of highways, hundreds of airport gates, and so forth at a much greater cost to meet future travel demands of a growing population in California.
And what's the latest projected time it would take to travel from Los Angeles to San Francisco on the train?
So the law requires that the system be designed for a nonstop trip of 2 hours and 40 minutes. And I know there was a recent LA Times article questioning this, but our engineers are confident that we are designing within that window. The actual train operation will probably be a little longer because it'll have stops, but it's still going to be probably around 3 hours, a little bit more, even with stops. The nonstop service should be 2 hours and 40 minutes, and we're holding to that. So, yes, it's a little bit of a challenge, but in fact, our current design is a few minutes ahead of that 2 hour and 40-minute window.
And what would be the median speed for the trip?
Well, the speed's going to vary at different locales. In the Central Valley, it's going to be hitting 200 miles an hour or more. But all these high-speed rail systems worldwide, when they come into urban areas, they're slower. So we're probably looking, between Burbank and LA Union Station, 110. But as you climb up through the tunnels up to Palmdale, you're going to be hitting speeds probably closer to 150, and then 200 out in the Central Valley and across up into San Jose.
We're talking with Dan Richard, Chair of the Board of Directors, the California High-Speed Rail Authority. Also with us from USC, Director of the Transportation Engineering Program there, and Professor of Industrial Systems and Civil Engineering, James Moore. Professor, thank you for joining us again. At this point, do you think the project still makes sense?
I never thought the project made sense. Current work to date suggests to me that it makes less sense than ever.
What are the reasons you think it's less logical now?
Well, I reach a very different set of conclusions than Dan. I don't believe that the system can operate by any remote set of assumptions as without a subsidy. We'll have to continue to subsidize it fairly intensively forever. The business plan assumptions that the authority tends to buy into are incredibly optimistic. They assume a more efficient cost structure than has ever been achieved to date in Europe or Japan. The assertion that European systems are self-sustaining is, I believe, inaccurate because those systems operate as two entities. One entity is rolling stock, the other is right-of-way. And when you combine the bottom line for the two, no system in Europe operates without a subsidy. We're not going to be the first. I don't know what the total cost is going to be. People ask me consistently what I think it will be, and I can't. Even if I extrapolate what was the original price tag of $33 billion out to $78 billion, there's really no way of knowing where this is going to stop. And, resources are very, very dear to us right now. There's much more we could be doing with that money.
What about Mr. Richards' point that the only alternative would be you'd have to significantly increase airport infrastructure by adding many more gates, or you'd have to significantly increase highway infrastructure for carrying capacity north-south in the state? Do you agree with that? And if so, how would you compare the costs of that versus high-speed rail?
Well, the costs that the authority attaches to expanding capacity for those modes look to me to be very inflated from their business plans. And those costs are borne by users. They're borne by the people who drive on the road in the form of gas taxes, assuming that the state actually uses the gas taxes for building roads, which is always good practice, and by the folks who use airlines. If we find ourselves in a subsidy situation with this new system, which we certainly will, the subsidy will be large. The Reason Foundation suggests it'll be at a minimum in the neighborhood of $125 million a year, but there are scenarios where it could run to $500 million a year. We're going to find ourselves paying continuously through some sort of general obligation to the tax-paying public. And the trade-off that Dan's calling out, I think, is a fictitious one. It's not a matter of taking one set of public resources and substituting another. It's shifting the cost of any new expansion necessary for intercity travel from the users to the general population. And that general population is the only entity that would ever be able to afford a system of this considerable expense and the subsidy it will require.
Now, I know you're not an economist, but what about the argument that this enables more people to be mobile between Northern and Southern California and that there would be some sort of an economic benefit from that?
I don't know many people who have trouble traveling from Northern to Southern California. Gasoline costs in the U.S. are the lowest of just about any place in the world, and as a result, automobiles hang on to a large share of shorter trips. We deregulated airlines in this country earlier than other countries, and as a result, intranational travel via air carrier is particularly inexpensive in the U.S., so airlines hang on to a large share shorter trips. That doesn't leave much room for high-speed rail to compete, and it would never compete if the service had to be offered at a fare that would recover operating costs. Demand would be effectively zero, and a system no one can afford is not going to help mobility.
I also wonder about the time issue because let's say it takes 2 hours and 40 minutes. You still, when you get to L.A., you're going to need some way of getting around, a car or something. I mean, you've still got if you take your own car, it's door to door, and you don't have any additional time that you have to build into it. So if you factor you're able to, do the trip in periods where there isn't heavy traffic on Interstate 5, I just wonder if the time savings really makes it even. I'm not sure I do it for time because I'm just not sure you get enough of a benefit once you factor everything else into it. Dan Richard, quick closing thought on this, and what would be the downside of walking away from this now?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I'd be happy to sit down with the professor, but the International Association of Railroads, which looks at all the international systems, disagrees with him on the subsidy issue. The Reason Foundation is very anti-rail. They always look at trying to recover the capital cost, not the operating. All of our numbers have been peer-reviewed multiple times, including the numbers of the alternative costs, which have been reviewed by the Federal Governmental Accountability Office. So we're happy to put our numbers up against anybody's. The system is going to operate without an operating subsidy. Our ridership numbers are quite conservative in that respect. And in fact, in Europe, if you look at this, most of the intercity traffic has moved from airline to rail. In California, 40% of the north-south flights are delayed. It's the most delayed air corridor in the country. And with all due respect, you're going to spend 6 hours on Highway 5 trying to get from one place to the other, and high-speed rail is going to be much faster than that. The downside of walking away is that California will continue to be committed to roads and clogged airports at a time when most of the world is moving away from that towards high-speed intercity rail. The state is perfectly amenable for that. It's going to be a privately operated system. And, it's a much more complex, longer issue. I'm happy to be back on any time, and I'm happy to sit down with the professor and go over our numbers with him.
All right, sounds good. We'll plan on having you back soon. That's Dan Richard, chair of the California High-Speed Rail Authority's board. James Moore, USC engineering professor and director of the Transportation Engineering Program. Coming up, the history of magic with a man who's designed some of the biggest acts in all of magic. Jim Steinmeier, co-author of The Secret History of Magic. We'll be back right after